I've been asked several times lately about where I get these rod blanks that look kind of like wood, and what they are fiberglass blanks. And the answer to that question is I get them all over the place. I find a lot of older rods at flea markets and thrift stores, and I clean them up and remove all the old components and build rods off of those. I've been working on a rod for my daughter for a while now, and I've posted a few videos that relate to that rod in particular, and I shot some video of the rod while I stripped it. I hadn't done anything with that video yet, but since this question's come up a few times, I thought I'd do a video about it and show you some of that footage. And I also talk a little bit in that video about these blanks and how you get them and how you clean them up. So I just thought I'd post a video about it, and hopefully it'll help somebody else find some of these rods that look like this. A lot of people don't use fiberglass rods anymore, and that's about all I use. I do have a few graphite rods, but I prefer the fiberglass rods because of their slow action. For the way that I fish, it just works really well. So I hope you enjoy the video, and if you have any questions or comments about it, please be sure to leave them in the comments section below. What I've got here is a Quantum ultralight rod. It's an older rod, and it was not built the way I would build an ultralight rod if I were building one from scratch. And I like to reuse things when I can, and this rod I picked up for just a couple of bucks at a thrift store or a flea market or something a while back. Is a good rebuild candidate because I like the blank itself. It's a one-piece rod. It's in pretty bad shape. I'm going to be replacing all the handle and grip section, and the epoxy on the guide wraps, you can tell, is coming off. It's flaking off. It turned yellow. It's not a real good epoxy job on that. And also the layout on the guides is just horrible. The front of the spool to the first guide, the stripper guide, is about 23.5 inches or more, depending on where the spool is in the travel. So it's really too far away, and it's also too close to the rod blank itself. So what happens there is, as you're casting, you get the line slapping the blank like that, and it slows your cast down as it's going out. All that will need to be reworked. I'm going to replace these guides with some guides that have a tall frame on them. The way that we fish, fiberglass is just fine. So it just depends on what you're doing, how you like to fish, how rough you are on your rods. The high modulus graphite rods will break a lot easier than a fiberglass or a composite rod will, or even a low modulus graphite. So those are just some things you want to keep in mind as you're picking rod blanks. We fish a lot of fiberglass, and composites are great too because they get a little more sensitivity than the older fiberglass, and they're also pretty durable. And we fish out of kayaks, things get tossed around, stuff breaks, it happens sometimes. So we tend to stick with rods that will hold up better to that type of environment. And I like the slow action of fiberglass personally. That's just something I like. I like casting ultralight lures with that slow action because it's almost like a slingshot effect. Now, if you get too heavy of a lure and you're using fiberglass, it makes it more difficult to get distance. But for light stuff, you can really launch light lures a long ways with fiberglass. So that's another reason why I prefer fiberglass and composite type rods over high modulus graphite rods. And it's all personal preference. There's no right or wrong answer. It's what you like. In this video, we're going to take this grip section off, remove these guides, and I'm probably going to remove the finish on this blank. It's scratched through in several places. I'm not real crazy about this painted on labeling that's coming off, and so I'll probably take this back down to a raw blank, and I have a feeling it's going to be a brown rod, which I really like the way that those look anyway. They kind of have a classic look to them to me. I can see some areas where this finish is scratched through, and it looks to be that kind of a dark honey brown underneath there. So I think that will clean up real well. So just to get started here, let's go ahead and take a look at this grip and see what we need to do to get it off. All right, we got our grip here, and I've got a plastic butt cap here, EVA grips, and a plastic reel seat. I don't even think that's a graphite reel seat. I think that's just a cheap plastic one. Now, graphite, of course, graphite reel seats also are plastic. They've also got carbon that's in the plastic to make it a little more rigid. To start out, I'm going to cut this butt cap off of this, and I'm just going to use a utility knife to do that. So I'm just going to cut away from me and push my utility knife through this butt cap. Actually, that thing's pretty loose. It might just turn off of there. I didn't have to cut it off. So these little butt caps have ridges in it, and they're glued on to this EVA foam. And those ridges are supposed to help give it something to adhere to. That wasn't even really stuck on there all that well. So that's good. That came off real easy. I might hang on to that butt cap. You never know when something like that might come in handy. Other than being dirty, it's actually in good shape. It doesn't have any cuts or anything in it. So I'll just hang on to that. And this EVA grip, it's on there really well. I'm sure it's epoxied on like it should be. I'm going to just cut down through it and see if I can get it started peeling off of this blank here. Now, when you do this, you want to make sure that you do not cut into the blank itself. If you do that, you're going to ruin your blank and have to trash the whole thing or save it for parts if you need ferrules or something you could make out of old blanks. I can see the actual color of the blank underneath here. I don't know if you can see that or not, but it is in fact that brown color like I thought it would be. And I like that color myself. I think it's got a real nice classic look to it. There you can start to see it a little bit better. And I've got a really blunt knife here. It's one of those old military knives that are made for eating eating food and things. It's not made for doing any kind of real work. I'm just going to scrape on that just a little bit to get some of that glue off of there. I'll just wet that with a little alcohol. And that's roughly the color of the blank. I like that look personally. It's kind of old school. It looks neat to me. I like it. I want to see if I can twist this off of here now. Get it to come loose. When I was twisting on that, the reel seat came loose. So it'll be interesting to see how they glued this reel seat on there. I've seen some weird things done underneath reel seats, and especially on stuff that's made in China, and you see all kinds of stuff when you start getting into what's underneath here. So it'll be interesting to see what's under there when we get it off. I'm just going to twist on that foam and see if I can get that to slide off of the butt of the rod here. There it came. Now the way this broke loose, I might get lucky and not have to cut this reel seat off here. I'm just going to try to twist it and see if I can get that to come off too. I think I'm going to get lucky and be able to get this seat off without having to cut it off. What you have to do sometimes is take a Dremel with a cutting wheel and just cut right down the center of these reel seats. And then you can usually pry them open with a flat blade screwdriver and break them and get them completely off. I think I'm actually going to be able to pull this off. I'll probably have to do it off camera where I can get a hold of it better. It's kind of hard to do this with the camera in the way and stuff, but I'll see if I can get that slid off of there, and then we'll come up and get the rest of that foregrip off of there. Okay, I was able to get that reel seat off, and what was underneath it's basically a cardboard arbor, and the reason it broke loose so easily is because that first layer of cardboard tears off real easily. Now getting this cardboard off of here might be a job, but we'll get it off. I'll probably end up cutting it off, and hopefully I can get it started, maybe get it to peel off of there somewhat. Well, I think I'll be able to peel it right now. I might have to cut. Some of these areas have a little epoxy still on them. And a lot of this cardboard is actually stuck inside of this reel seat, which I know y'all won't be able to see here. But it's like the first layer of cardboard stuck in the reel seat and came off with the reel seat, but the rest of the cardboard's still on here, and there's a little bit of glue in some of these areas, so I'm just going to kind of scrape some of that through and see if I can just peel this off of here for the most part. Reminds me of those cans of biscuits where you peel it and push on a little and it pops open. So you can see what I'm going to have to do with this here. So I'll probably just stop the video here and peel that down, and then I'll come back and take this foregrip off of here. I got most of the cardboard off of there, so now I want to see if I can get this foregrip off of here. I'm going to have to cut it off. It's stuck pretty good. Again, make sure you don't cut deep enough to get into your rod blank there. And it has a rubber winding check here. Alright, and this little trim here, this thread trim with the epoxy over it's going to have to come off too. I'm going to just kind of scrape that down a little here. See if I can knock it down just a little where that edge is. That epoxy is just flaking off of there real easy. And now I'll probably see if I can get this thread to start and just roll that thread off of there. Alright, so that's that in with most of the mess cleaned off of it. I've got to come back and scrape all this down. I'm also going to be scraping down the finish on this rod blank. And when I get done, the whole thing will be this kind of a dark honey brown. It's going to look really nice when we're done. Now I'm going to be using a heat gun and a tool that I showed on another video to remove these guides. I'm going to use the heat gun to soften the epoxy. I'm going to use the tool to cut into the epoxy enough to where I can get one of these threads pulled loose and start unwinding the thread. Once you get the thread started, you can usually unwind it and most of the epoxy will come off with the thread. If you did not see the video for this little tool, all it is a blade from a deburring tool, and I just drilled a wooden dowel and epoxied that blade into here, and it's got a little bit of a curvature to it. I think you can see there, which is nice for doing rod blanks. You can use it for scraping rod blanks to get finish off. Now you don't want to cut it at an angle into the rod blank because it will cut right through your blank and ruin it. But if you hold it perpendicular to the rod blank, you can scrape old finish off with it, and it doesn't take much pressure at all to do that. So I'll be using that for scraping down the blank also. But right now I want to get these guides off of this blank. So I'm just going to heat this up a little bit with the little heat gun here. I'm going to keep my fingers close to it. I don't want it so hot that I can't stand it. That would be bad for the blank. I'm just wanting to warm it up enough to where that epoxy will soften just a little bit. That's probably good. It doesn't take much. And the kind of shape this epoxy's in, I'm probably not going to have any problems with it anyway. I'm going to cut on top of the guide foot. That way, if I cut a little too deep, I won't get into my rod blank. Although with this tool, I've got a lot of control using it. I don't think I would have a problem, but just to be on the safe side, it's always a good idea to cut on top of that foot because it's metal. If you cut through the epoxy and thread and get into that guide, it's not going to hurt anything. So I made a little cut there, and I can get this thread started now and just start unwrapping it. This epoxy is in terrible condition, so I don't anticipate it being much of a problem to get it off. It's really brittle, it's really thin, which is fine, but for whatever reason this epoxy is brittle. It's yellowed really badly, and it's really not sticking very well either. I have a feeling they mixed it up a little hot. Maybe a little too much hardener, or they use something that most people don't use, because ordinarily it's a lot harder than that to get the epoxy off, but that came off real easy. And this guide's not in bad shape. I'll hang on to it as a spare. You never know when you might need to replace a guide on another rod and you don't have one that's the right size. You can dig through your old ones and find a replacement sometimes. If you're real careful and you're trying to save your finish, you can scrape it down enough with this tool to get it off and save your finish if you're really careful. I'm not even putting any pressure on this tool. I'm just kind of letting it float with the weight of my finger as the pressure, just letting it float on the surface there. And I'm not really concerned about not messing up this finish. I'm just going to show you what you can do with this tool if you're trying to be careful with that finish. You can actually get the bulk of it off without going too deep into your finish. And to me, it's a little easier than even using sandpaper, unless you're using wet sandpaper and doing it that way. And the rest of that would probably just come off with your fingernail pretty easily. But you could get that off, get an old guide off and scrape it down a little bit and come back and put your guide on there and be good to go, if that's what we're doing. Now I'm going to be removing this finish, so I'm just going to show you really quickly. If you do put a little pressure on this, and it doesn't take much, and that's down to the blank in that area. I think you can see that. And it's really smooth. It doesn't have any raised areas on it. And that will make a good way to get this finish and the old epoxy off of this blank and get it back down to a bare blank. And we can refinish the blank at that point and begin building on it. You want to rotate it and keep your heat source moving. That way you don't get it too hot in one spot. I'm just going to see what that tip top feels like there. It's fairly warm. I'm just going to give it a little pull. It's not wanting to come yet, so I'm going to keep heating it. See what we got now. There it comes. All right. And it's hot enough now that it is really warm on my fingers. Hot enough to make me think about letting go of it. But it's not so hot that it's going to burn my skin. So that way, if you get it to where it's uncomfortable to the touch, but you can hold it if you need to, that's about the right temperature you want, so you don't damage your rod in any way. Because if you reheat the resin that is in the fibers itself, and then it re-cools, it's going to be brittle in that area. So you don't want to do that. You don't want to get this hot enough that the blank resin gets heated enough to soften it, because when it re-hardens, it's going to become brittle. Use some caution with your heat, and I would err on the side of caution and just check and recheck. And if you put your fingers on there and it's really hot and you can get it to move just a little bit, then you can usually pull it straight off. I wouldn't do it in a twisting motion, because sometimes when you do that, if you did get this a little too hot, it will start pulling the fibers apart on the rod itself. Go slower than fast. There's no reason to be in a hurry to get that tip top off. I'd rather heat it up slowly and keep rechecking it than to make a mistake and ruin your tip. I'm going to remove these two guides, and then we'll come back and get to work on this nasty end here and see what we can do to get that cleaned up the rest of the way. All right, now we're back to this end and getting the bulk of this off, this old epoxy. It's really a mess. This will be time consuming. I'm going to show you what I'm going to do so you can get a general idea. There's no reason to show the whole thing, I don't think. I'm just taking this tool, and in the areas where I've got a lot of epoxy, I'm just having to scrape it down. And in some areas there's a clump there. I'll have to cut it off. And that's what I like about this tool. There's a lot of control with it if you put your thumb into it and just kind of twist with this hand here. Twist it back this way. Use your thumb to apply the pressure. You can really control how deep you go with this so that you don't cut into the blank. It takes a little practice, but once you get used to it, you can really have a lot of control over how you're cutting some of this old stuff off. And this tool itself will stay sharp for a long time. It's made for cutting metal, so cutting into epoxy is really not any kind of a big deal for it. I'll scrape some of this old EVA foam off of this end. I might try to heat this epoxy up just a little bit. So what's working best for this thicker epoxy for me right now is to heat it up a little and do a small section at a time and scrape it off. Now I've got all this end cleaned off where the real seat was, and it cleaned up real well. I did not go too deep. I'm rubbing my fingers along it here. I'm not feeling the fiberglass fibers grab my fingers. So did a good job not getting too deep on that. And I'm going to take a little rubbing alcohol here and a paper towel and just wet it with the rubbing alcohol a little bit. And I'm just going to rub this over. This will give you a good idea of what this rod will look like once it gets a finish on it. And these things to me always look really nice. That alcohol dries really fast, but you can see that kind of golden brownish color. Real pretty. And there's a lot of rods that were built in the 80s and the early 90s that were made the same way as the old ones, and I suspect that's what this one is. I think it's just a regular fiberglass rod. I don't know that there's any carbon content. To me, it really doesn't matter. You just look at the action of the rod, check the sensitivity of it. If everything is okay with you, then that's all you really need to know. Anything else is just for your own knowledge, I guess. But so that's what that looks like. And I'll see if I can get a picture of it and put it up here, and you can take a look at that too. Now, as you can see here, I'm just continuing to work my way up the rod. The reel seat area is all cleaned up. I'm working my way up the rod to remove all the rod finish, and I'll just speed up through part of this process, and then we'll come back when we get it completely cleaned up.